Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
People always say the divine feminine awakens first because she's more spiritual, more intuitive, more emotionally evolved. I don't think that's the full truth. I think she awakens first because she feels everything first. The shift in his tone, the hesitation after intimacy, the way he suddenly starts replying like a coworker after spending all night wrapped around her like she was home. And honestly, that awareness doesn't feel magical most of the time. It feels humiliating. Because while he's distracting himself, going quiet, acting confused, pretending nothing happened, she's sitting there replaying one tiny moment for 3 straight weeks, wondering why her body knew before her mind did that something had changed. And the worst part is, a lot of the time, he felt it too. He just couldn't stay in it long enough to admit it. Nobody really talks about how exhausting it is to notice everything first. Not in a poetic way. Not in a gifted, intuitive, feminine kind of way. I mean, exhausting in the physical sense. Like your body starts reacting before your thoughts even catch up. Your stomach tightens over a 3-word text message. Your chest feels heavy because his voice sounded slightly flatter on the phone, and now you're trying to convince yourself you imagined it. You suddenly can't focus on the movie you're watching because something shifted in him 2 days ago and your nervous system picked it up before your pride did. And the embarrassing part is, sometimes nothing obvious even happened. That's what makes it so hard to explain to other people. Because from the outside, he still texts, still calls you baby, still watches your stories, still asks how your day was. But something underneath it changes. The warmth changes first. That's usually how it starts. Not the words. The temperature. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. I remember one night specifically. Nothing dramatic happened. That's the thing. No breakup. No screaming. No betrayal. We were laying in bed after talking for hours. One of those conversations that accidentally becomes too honest around 1:30 in the morning. The room was dark except for the TV screen flashing muted colors against the wall, because neither of us had bothered turning it off. He had his arm around me, but it felt different somehow. Looser. Not physically. Emotionally. Like part of him had already started retreating while his body was still there. And I remember hating myself a little for noticing. Because who notices things like that? Who lies there analyzing the emotional weight of an arm round their waist? Apparently someone who's about to suffer more than the other person. That's the ugly truth nobody says out loud. The feminine notices the emotional shift first, which means she starts grieving first too, even before there's technically anything to grieve. And that phase is maddening because you don't have proof yet. Only sensations. Tiny behavioral fractures. Micro-reactions. He takes 4 hours to reply instead of 40 minutes. And you immediately start arguing with yourself. Relax. He's probably busy. You're becoming anxious again. Don't do this. So you put the phone down. Then pick it back up 3 minutes later without even realizing you did it. And suddenly your entire emotional state is attached to whether the screen lights up. Which feels ridiculous. Humiliating even. Especially because part of you knows how irrational it sounds. But another part, the deeper part, already knows something changed. That's the strange thing about emotional awareness. People romanticize it. They think awakening means peace or clarity or spiritual wisdom or whatever. Sometimes it just means your body can no longer comfortably lie to itself. Sometimes it means you notice when someone emotionally leaves the room before they physically do. And honestly, that awareness can make you feel insane for a while. because the other person usually keeps acting normal enough to make you question yourself. That's what happened with him. He didn't suddenly become cold overnight. It was subtler than that. Worse, actually. He still reached for me in his sleep. Still sent me random videos. Still talked about future plans casually. But there were pauses now. Tiny hesitations. Like he'd open up emotionally, then immediately regret it afterward. I noticed it most after vulnerable moments. That was the pattern I couldn't stop seeing. Every time we got emotionally closer, he pulled away slightly afterward. Not dramatically. Not enough to fully confront. Just enough to make me feel emotionally carsick. Like we were constantly moving forward and backward at the same time. And once you see that pattern, it becomes impossible not to monitor it. You start paying attention to everything. His tone after intimacy, the length of his silences, whether his good night feels affectionate or automatic. You become hyper-aware in ways that don't even feel healthy anymore. I remember staring at a message from him once for almost 10 minutes because he ended the sentence with a period. A period. That's how emotionally deep into it you can get when your nervous system no longer feels safe. Because it's never actually about punctuation. It's about inconsistency. The body notices inconsistency long before the mind creates a narrative for it. And the really painful part, sometimes she knows he's pulling away before he consciously knows it himself. That's why these connections become so psychologically confusing. Because he'll genuinely say, "Nothing's wrong." And part of him even believes that. Meanwhile, she's sitting there silently absorbing emotional static he hasn't fully processed yet. And people call her crazy for noticing. But she's not crazy. She's just emotionally awake in a room where the other person is still suppressing half of what they feel. There's a difference. Although, to be fair, sometimes awareness and anxiety do blur together. I think that's important to admit. Because not every feminine reaction is sacred intuition. Sometimes old wounds get involved. Sometimes abandonment fears start speaking louder than reality. Sometimes past heartbreak teaches the body to panic too early. That's the uncomfortable complexity nobody online likes talking about. Because it ruins the clean spiritual narrative. Sometimes she is intuitive. Sometimes she is projecting. Sometimes it's both at once. Human emotions are messy like that. I remember sitting in my car one night replaying one tiny interaction over and over again like it was security footage from a crime scene. He hugged me goodbye, held me tightly, kissed my forehead. Everything looked normal. But right before he pulled away, there was this strange sadness in his eyes. Just for a second. And I could not stop thinking about it afterward. I drove around for almost an hour instead of going home. No music. Just streetlights flashing across the windshield while my brain kept replaying his expression. What was that? Did I imagine it? Why did that feel final somehow? And the worst part is, I think part of me already knew. Not consciously, but physically. The body knows. That sentence used to annoy me when people said it because it sounded so abstract and spiritual. Now I think it's actually painfully literal. Your appetite changes. Your sleep changes. Your concentration disappears. You suddenly start cleaning your apartment at midnight because emotional overwhelm has nowhere else to go. You open his profile, close it, reopen it 20 minutes later, tell yourself you're done caring, then immediately wonder who liked his photo. It's humiliating, especially for women who pride themselves on being emotionally self-aware, because awareness doesn't automatically stop attachment. Sometimes it just makes you watch yourself unravel in high definition. And I think that's part of why the feminine suffers more in the beginning. Not because she's weak, not because she's more emotional, but because she stays emotionally present longer, even when it hurts, even when her instincts are telling her something's off. She keeps trying to understand, to connect, to emotionally hold the relationship steady while the other person starts drifting internally. And that creates this horrible invisible loneliness where you're technically still together, but you can already feel the distance forming. That kind of grief is difficult to explain unless you've lived it, because nobody validates pre-loss grief. Nobody talks about the pain of mourning someone who's still texting you, still showing up, still saying I miss you, just differently now. Less warmth, less openness, less emotional risk. And the feminine notices every millimeter of it. That's the curse. She notices when he becomes slightly more performative, when his affection becomes less spontaneous, when his attention feels divided even while he's sitting right beside her. And she starts asking herself questions she doesn't want the answers to. Am I overthinking? Or worse, am I actually seeing this clearly? Because once you realize your intuition might be right, everything changes. Then every silence becomes loud. Every delayed response feels symbolic. Every moment of emotional hesitation starts echoing inside your body. And eventually, she gets tired. Not dramatic tired. Deep nervous system tired. The kind where you stop wanting reassurance because reassurance no longer reaches the part of you that feels unsafe. The kind where you smile during conversations while emotionally bracing for loss at the exact same time, which is a very lonely way to love someone. And maybe that's the real reason the feminine awakens first. Not because she's chosen, not because she's spiritually superior, but because someone in the relationship has to be emotionally awake enough to notice when intimacy starts turning into avoidance. Even when nobody says that out loud yet. Even when the other person is still pretending everything is fine. Even when part of her wishes she could pretend to. I think some relationships change quietly first. Not through betrayal. Not through screaming. Not through someone dramatically walking away in the rain like a movie scene. Sometimes the entire emotional direction of a connection changes during one completely ordinary night where nobody technically does anything wrong. That's what makes it so hard to explain later. Because when you try to describe it to people, it sounds small. Too small. He just seemed different. Okay, different how? That's the problem. You can feel it in your body long before you can explain it logically. And honestly, I think some of the deepest feminine suffering begins there, in the space between emotional perception and physical proof. I remember the exact night with him. Not every detail. Memory is strange like that. Some parts blur. Some parts stay painfully sharp for years. I don't remember what shirt I was wearing, but I remember the sound of the ice in his glass when he set it down on the kitchen counter. I remember the way he exhaled after laughing. I remember how long he looked at me after I finished talking. Too long. Like he forgot to hide something for a second. We had spent the entire evening together doing almost nothing important. That's usually when people become real. Not during big romantic moments. Not during vacations. Not during anniversary dinners. It happens in tiny, ordinary spaces. Sitting on the floor eating takeout half cold because you kept getting distracted talking. Hearing someone yawn from the other room. Watching them rub their face when they're tired and don't realize you're looking at them. Intimacy hides in mundane things. That night felt soft. Safe, even. Which is ironic considering what came after. We stayed up till late for no reason. The TV was on, and neither of us was really watching it. At some point, the conversation shifted accidentally deeper. You know those conversations that sneak up on you? One vulnerable sentence opens another door. then another. Then, suddenly, two people are sitting there emotionally exposed without meaning to be. That's what happened. He started talking about his father first. Not in a dramatic way. Actually, that's what made it feel real. He said it casually at first, like he almost didn't care. Yeah, he was around technically. Then he laughed a little afterward. Not because it was funny. One of those small masculine laughs people use when they don't want to fully feel what they're saying. I noticed that too. And I remember something in me softening immediately. Not because he was broken. Not because I wanted to save him. It was more human than that. It's just when someone finally stops performing strength for a second, you instinctively move closer emotionally. And he did. Slowly. Carefully. Like someone touching a hot stove expecting pain. He started admitting things in fragments. How he struggled sitting still with his emotions. How silence made him anxious. How sometimes he'd pull away from people right when he started caring about them. Then he looked away immediately after saying it. That part stayed with me, because it felt like watching someone accidentally tell the truth about themselves and instantly regret it. And the strange thing is, I don't think he planned to reveal any of that. It just slipped out, because for one brief moment he felt emotionally safe enough to stop managing himself. That's usually when the shift happens. Not after conflict. After closeness. People talk constantly about fear of abandonment. Nobody talks enough about fear of intimacy. Because intimacy sounds beautiful in theory, until someone actually sees you. Then, suddenly your nervous system starts acting like visibility is danger. And I think that's what happened to him that night. Not immediately. Not obviously. At first, he actually became more affectionate. That's the confusing part. After the conversation, he pulled me closer, held my face differently, kept staring at me like he was trying to understand something. At one point, he said quietly, "You make me feel calm." And for some reason, that sentence hurt me later more than the obvious painful things ever did. Because he meant it. That's what destroyed me. He meant it when he said it. I know people want simple narratives. They want one person to be fake and the other person to be genuine. But real emotional situations are uglier than that. Sometimes someone genuinely feels safe with you, and that safety terrifies them afterward. I didn't understand that yet back then. Back then I just thought, finally he's letting me in. And honestly, part of him was. That's why the next part felt so emotionally violent even though nothing dramatic happened externally. It started maybe 30 minutes later. Tiny things. That's how emotional withdrawal begins most of the time. Tiny things. His energy changed first. Not his behavior. His energy. His body was still beside me, but mentally he felt further away somehow. He became quieter, then overly casual, then weirdly distracted. Like he suddenly remembered himself. Like vulnerability had sobered him up. I remember talking and realizing he wasn't fully present anymore. Not completely gone, just partially elsewhere. And if you've experienced this kind of dynamic before, you know exactly what I mean. It's the moment someone emotionally flinches after closeness. Like their system suddenly goes, "That was too much. You revealed too much. Pull back now." The feminine notices that shift immediately. Not because she's magical. Because emotionally attentive people notice inconsistency fast. Especially after intimacy. And the horrible part is, she usually starts minimizing her own perception almost instantly. I did. I started internally negotiating against myself in real time. You're imagining things. He's just tired. Don't ruin the moment. Don't become emotionally needy right now. So instead of saying what I felt, I became quieter too. That's how these nights become emotionally haunting later. Two people silently reacting to the same emotional moment in opposite ways. One moving closer internally, one beginning to retreat, and neither fully saying it out loud. At one point he picked up his phone. Such a small thing. But I still remember the feeling in my chest when he did it. Not because checking a phone is bad. Normal people check their phones. But emotionally, it felt abrupt. Like the atmosphere cracked for a second. And once you feel the crack, you can't stop hearing it. After that, everything became hyper-specific in my memory. The pause before he answered questions. The way his affection suddenly felt slightly performative. How he kissed me quickly instead of slowly before leaving. Tiny things. Tiny, tiny things. But the body remembers emotional contrast. That's what people don't understand. The feminine isn't reacting only to what happened. She's reacting to the difference between before and after. And after that night, something changed. Even though technically nothing was wrong. That's the maddening part. The next morning, he still texted me. Still called me beautiful. Still acted affectionate enough to make me doubt myself. But there was distance inside the warmth now. Like he was slowly putting emotional gloves back on. I remember sitting on my bathroom floor days later staring at one message from him for almost 20 minutes. Because I could feel the emotional reduction inside it. Same words. Different presence. That's what hurt. And honestly, I became a little obsessive after that. Not externally. Internally. I replayed every moment from that night constantly. The look in his eyes. The softness in his voice. The withdrawal afterward. Trying to figure out which part was real. The closeness, or the distance after? And the answer was probably both. That's the painful maturity nobody wants to hear. Sometimes the intimacy is real, and the fear afterward is real too. Those things can exist simultaneously inside someone, especially someone emotionally avoidant. And avoidant people are confusing because they often move toward intimacy emotionally, then panic once they actually arrive there. So the feminine ends up trapped in emotional whiplash. One moment she feels deeply chosen. The next she feels someone emotionally backing away while still holding her hand. It creates this horrible psychological confusion where you stop trusting your own perception. Because the mixed signals are real. The warmth is real. The retreat is real. The care is real. The fear is real. And when you're emotionally bonded to someone like that, your nervous system starts living inside contradiction. That's exhausting. I think back now to that version of myself sometimes. The girl lying awake afterward pretending she was fine. Scrolling mindlessly through social media while emotionally replaying his tone change frame by frame. Trying not to look too emotional. Trying not to scare him away. Trying not to ask for reassurance. Meanwhile, internally, everything already felt different. And maybe the saddest part is, I think he felt it too. I really do. I think part of him knew that night mattered. Which is exactly why he started pulling away afterward. Because closeness exposes people. Not just emotionally. Psychologically. It exposes how much they actually have to lose now. And some people can only tolerate intimacy right up until it becomes real. Then suddenly they need space, distraction, distance, control. Not because they feel nothing. Sometimes because they feel too much. But that doesn't make the feminine suffer less. If anything, it makes it worse. Because now she's grieving someone who still looks at her with love in his eyes while simultaneously backing away from her emotionally. And that kind of pain is incredibly difficult to explain to people who've never lived it. It's not clean enough to justify heartbreak publicly, but privately, it changes everything. The spiraling doesn't usually begin with drama. It begins with interruption. Tiny interruptions inside the body. You're at work answering emails and suddenly realize you've reread the same sentence 4 times because part of your brain is somewhere else entirely. You're brushing your teeth and replaying his tone from yesterday. You're in the grocery store staring at pasta sauce while wondering why his good morning text felt emotionally thinner than usual. And the worst part is, you know how ridiculous it sounds. That's what makes the feminine spiral so psychologically exhausting. She's not fully unconscious while it's happening. Part of her is observing herself the entire time thinking, this is unhealthy. You're overanalyzing. You need to calm down. Meanwhile, another part of her is quietly whispering, know something changed. And living between those 2 voices can make a person feel emotionally insane. I think people misunderstand spiraling. They imagine emotional chaos looking dramatic, crying constantly, calling repeatedly, breaking down publicly. Sometimes spiraling looks incredibly functional. She still goes to work, still answers texts, still posts normal photos, still laughs at dinner with friends. Meanwhile, internally, her nervous system is running survival scans every 15 minutes, checking emotional temperature, checking for distance, checking for proof she's still emotionally safe. That kind of hypervigilance is exhausting because it turns ordinary life into emotional detective work. And honestly, it's embarrassing how small the triggers become. I remember once he took 2 hours to respond after being consistently affectionate all week. 2 hours. That's it. Objectively normal. But because of the emotional inconsistency that had already started building, my entire body reacted before logic could intervene. I checked my phone, put it down, picked it back up 30 seconds later. Then I got angry at myself for caring. So I tried acting detached. That's another thing nobody admits. Sometimes the feminine starts performing nonchalance while internally unraveling. You tell yourself, I'm matching energy now. I'm pulling back too. I'm not going to care more than him. Then 5 minutes later, you're reading old conversations trying to figure out where the emotional shift started. Not because you're weak. Because emotionally bonded people search for coherence when connection becomes unstable. The body wants emotional consistency, especially after intimacy. And when it disappears suddenly, the nervous system treats it like danger. I used to hate hearing people talk about the nervous system online because it started sounding trendy and overused. But unfortunately, it's real. You feel it physically. Loss of appetite, random anxiety spikes, difficulty sleeping, chest tightness after certain conversations. Your body reacts to emotional withdrawal even while your mind is still trying to rationalize it. And the feminine often suffers first because she stays emotionally connected after contact ends. That's the important part. He leaves the conversation and mentally shifts into work mode or distraction mode or compartmentalization mode. Meanwhile, she's still emotionally inside the interaction 3 hours later. Still replaying it. Still processing it. Still feeling it in her body. That difference creates massive emotional imbalance, especially in connections where the masculine avoids his own feelings by staying busy. Because while he's distracting himself, she's metabolizing the relationship emotionally in real time. And honestly, that can become humiliating after a while. I remember sitting with friends once pretending to listen to a conversation while secretly watching whether he viewed my story. Not because I wanted attention, because I wanted reassurance. There's a difference. And when he finally viewed it, I felt immediate relief. Then immediate shame for feeling relieved. That emotional contradiction is brutal. Relief, shame, longing, pride, resentment, all existing at the same time. Nobody really prepares you for how emotionally ugly attachment can feel once insecurity enters it, especially for women who usually feel emotionally composed, because suddenly you become someone you barely recognize. Checking timestamps, analyzing punctuation, feeling emotionally affected by response speed. I remember typing long messages sometimes, then deleting them entirely. Not because I had nothing to say, because I became hyper-aware of appearing too much. That phrase alone probably damaged an entire generation emotionally. Too much, too emotional, too sensitive, too available, too reactive. So instead of expressing what she feels honestly, the feminine often starts editing herself in real time, making herself smaller emotionally while simultaneously becoming bigger internally, which creates pressure, a lot of pressure, and eventually that pressure has nowhere to go. So becomes rumination, obsessive thinking, emotional replaying, internal conversations that never end. I used to drive at night sometimes just to regulate my thoughts. No destination, just movement. There was something about driving through empty streets that matched the emotional atmosphere inside me. Quiet, restless, unresolved, and every red light became another opportunity to replay his behavior. The pause before he answered, the distance after closeness, the inconsistency between his words and energy. I kept trying to solve him emotionally like he was a puzzle that would finally make me feel safe once understood. That's another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the feminine mistakes understanding someone for emotional security. If I can just figure out why he's pulling away, if I can understand his wounds, if I can love him correctly, then maybe the connection will stabilize. But people are not regulated through analysis, and avoidant behavior especially will drive an emotionally aware person into mental exhaustion because the signals constantly conflict. One day he misses you intensely. The next day he disappears emotionally. Then he returns warm again. That inconsistency creates dependency in a really unhealthy way. Because now your emotional state starts organizing itself around unpredictability. And unpredictability is addictive. Not because it feels good, because intermittent affection creates obsession, especially when deep intimacy already exists underneath it. I think that's why the feminine starts spiraling before the masculine fully does. She emotionally stays in contact with the connection continuously. He disconnects from it temporarily to self-regulate. At least that's what it felt like with him. I remember one specific night so clearly. I had finally decided. I'm pulling back. I'm done overthinking. I'm getting my energy back. Then he sent one soft message. Just one. Thinking about you tonight. That was it. And instantly my entire emotional structure collapsed again. Because when you're emotionally attached, tiny moments become disproportionately powerful, especially after distance. I stared at that message for so long it was honestly pathetic. Then came the internal dialogue. Don't answer too fast. That's childish. But don't seem desperate. Why are you strategizing human emotion? Because you care more. Do I? Yes. Damn. That's the part people don't talk about enough. The feminine often becomes painfully self-aware during these dynamics. She knows she's spiraling while it's happening, knows she's emotionally over-focused, knows she's seeking reassurance, knows she's monitoring shifts obsessively. But awareness alone doesn't stop attachment. Sometimes it just makes the suffering more conscious. And eventually, the spiraling creates emotional exhaustion so deep that even small interactions start feeling loaded. A delayed text can ruin an afternoon. A cold tone can trigger physical anxiety. A short conversation can leave her emotionally unsettled for hours. Meanwhile, she keeps trying to look normal externally. That's the strange loneliness of this experience. Nobody around you fully sees it. Your friends just think you're distracted lately. They don't see you lying awake replaying one sentence over and over, wondering if you imagined the emotional withdrawal. They don't see you opening his profile absent-mindedly like muscle memory. They don't see you trying to stop caring and failing repeatedly. And honestly, sometimes the feminine becomes angry at herself before she becomes angry at him, because she can feel her emotional center slowly shifting away from herself. That loss of self-focus feels terrifying, especially if she used to be independent, emotionally grounded, secure, clear-minded. Now, suddenly she's crying because his energy fell off for 2 days. That identity disruption alone can create shame. I remember once standing in my kitchen after he canceled plans unexpectedly. Nothing dramatic. He even had a valid reason. But after we hung up, I just stood there staring at the counter, feeling emotionally hollow in a way that genuinely scared me. Not because of the canceled plans, because of how emotionally destabilized I had become from inconsistency. And that's when I realized something difficult. The spiraling wasn't only about him anymore. It was also about what the connection was activating inside me. Fear, hypervigilance, emotional uncertainty, all the abandonment wounds I thought I had already healed. And I think maturity is admitting both things can be true simultaneously. Yes, his inconsistency affected me. Yes, my unresolved wounds amplified it. Human relationships are rarely one-sided psychologically. But still, there's something uniquely painful about being the one who feels the emotional fracture first. The one who notices the drift while the other person is still half present. The one losing sleep while the other person is compartmentalizing. The one trying to emotionally hold the connection together silently. That imbalance changes people. It makes the feminine hyper-aware, emotionally tired, sometimes controlling without meaning to be, sometimes anxious in ways she hates admitting, and eventually, she starts craving peace more than passion. That's the beginning of the deeper shift. Not when she stops loving him, when loving him starts exhausting her more than losing him does. And that realization usually arrives very quietly, late at night, phone in hand, heart tired, still hoping for reassurance, while simultaneously wishing she didn't need it anymore. I think one of the hardest things to admit is that avoidance doesn't always look mean. Sometimes it looks polite. Sometimes it looks emotionally exhausted. Sometimes it looks busy. Sometimes it looks like someone trying very hard to keep functioning while internally short-circuiting. And that complexity makes it harder to let go. Because if he were obviously terrible, the feminine could leave faster. But a lot of these men are not heartless. They're conflicted, which honestly creates a different kind of pain. A slower one. Because now she's not grieving abuse. She's grieving inconsistency, emotional unavailability, half-love, interrupted closeness. That's much harder to explain to yourself at 2 a.m., especially when part of him genuinely cares. I remember watching it happen in real time with him. The more emotionally close we became, the more fragmented he started acting afterward. Not all at once. That's important. Avoidance usually arrives gradually enough to keep hope alive. That's why it becomes psychologically addictive. 1 week he'd feel deeply emotionally present, calling more, opening up more, looking at me in that soft and guarded way that made me feel like his entire nervous system relaxed around me. Then suddenly, distance. Not full disappearance. Just subtle emotional reduction. Less emotional risk. Less vulnerability. More surface-level conversations. And the feminine notices those reductions immediately because emotionally connected people measure intimacy differently. Not through frequency, through presence. A man can text all day and still feel emotionally absent. And honestly, that confused me for a long time. Because externally, he still showed up. He still checked on me. Still wanted to see me. Still acted affectionate enough to make me doubt my own instincts. But internally something kept fluctuating inside him. I could feel it. One day, he'd hold me like he was afraid to lose me. The next day, he'd respond to emotional conversations with jokes. That emotional whiplash changes a person slowly. Especially when you love someone empathetic enough to care, but emotionally unequipped enough to stay fully present in intimacy. I think people misunderstand avoidant men sometimes. Not all of them are cold players calculating emotional damage. Some are just emotionally overwhelmed humans with terrible coping mechanisms. That doesn't erase the pain they cause, but it changes the emotional atmosphere of the relationship. Because now the feminine isn't dealing with obvious rejection. She's dealing with emotional confusion. And confusion is psychologically exhausting. I remember one night we were sitting in his car after dinner. It had rained earlier, so the windows kept fogging slightly. The whole atmosphere felt quiet. Heavy somehow. I asked him a simple question. "Are you okay?" And immediately I saw that look cross his face. That look emotionally avoidant people get when they know the real answer is complicated. He paused too long before speaking, then shrugged. Yeah, just tired. And maybe part of him believed that. But emotionally, it felt incomplete. I remember wanting to ask more questions, wanting to pull honesty out of him gently, but I could already feel him retreating internally. So instead, I nodded and changed the subject. That happens a lot in these dynamics. The feminine starts emotionally accommodating the masculine's discomfort without realizing how much self-abandonment is slowly happening inside her. She learns which topics make him withdraw, learns which emotions overwhelm him, learns how to keep connection stable by suppressing parts of herself. And eventually, she becomes emotionally lonely inside the relationship itself. That's the tragedy. Because externally everything still looks mostly fine. Meanwhile, internally she's starving for emotional consistency. And him, he's usually trying to escape the pressure of his own emotions without fully understanding that's what he's doing. That's why avoidance often looks immature instead of malicious. He distracts himself. Work suddenly becomes his entire personality. The gym becomes sacred. He stays busy constantly, keeps conversations light, uses humor to escape vulnerability. And honestly, sometimes he doesn't even realize he's avoiding. That's the scary part. Avoidance can become so automatic it feels like personality instead of protection. I remember him becoming weirdly energetic after emotionally intimate nights. Almost restless. Like closeness activated something uncomfortable inside him that needed immediate escape. One morning, after we spent an entire night talking honestly, he suddenly became hyper-focused on random errands. Cleaning his car, answering emails, talking about work, checking sports scores. It almost felt mechanical. At first, I took it personally. I thought, he regrets last night. He doesn't want closeness anymore. But now I think it was more complicated than that. I think intimacy dysregulated him. Not because he didn't care, because he did. And that emotional exposure created anxiety he didn't know how to sit with. Some men were taught how to pursue intimacy, but never taught how to sustain it emotionally once they actually receive it. So, when real closeness happens, their system starts panicking quietly. And instead of saying, "I'm overwhelmed by how much I feel," they say, "I'm just busy lately," or "I need space," or the classic, "I don't know what's wrong with me," which sounds vague and frustrating because honestly, it is. Especially for the feminine who's trying to emotionally understand a man actively disconnecting from his own emotional reality. That dynamic can drive a person into obsession. Because mixed signals create hyperfixation. The warmth keeps returning just enough to prevent emotional closure. I remember one particular weekend so clearly. He spent the entire Saturday deeply affectionate, holding my hand constantly, kissing my forehead absent-mindedly, looking genuinely peaceful around me. At one point, he even pulled me closer while we were half asleep and whispered, "I miss this," very quietly, like he didn't mean to say it out loud. And those moments are devastating later because they feel real, not manipulative, not fake, real. Then the next day, emotionally distant, not cruel, not angry, just elsewhere. His responses became shorter, his energy flatter, his attention fragmented, and the feminine experiences that shift almost physically, like emotional vertigo. One moment connection, next moment uncertainty. I remember sitting on my bed that night staring at our conversation, wondering how the same person could feel so emotionally different within 24 hours. Then came the overthinking. Did I do something? Did intimacy scare him? Was yesterday more real than today? Which version is actually him? And honestly, probably both. That's the difficult truth. Part of him wanted closeness deeply. Another part associated emotional dependence with danger. So he kept moving toward intimacy, then unconsciously punishing himself for it afterward through withdrawal. And the feminine usually personalizes that cycle at first. She assumes his retreat means she's too emotional, too available, too loving. But a lot of avoidant behavior starts long before her, long before the relationship. Some people learned early that vulnerability creates loss, or disappointment, or engulfment, or shame. So now intimacy activates grief and fear at the exact same time. And unless they consciously work on that, they end up hurting people they genuinely care about. That's the part nobody likes talking about. Someone can love you and still repeatedly fail you emotionally. Both things can exist together. And accepting that is heartbreaking because it removes the fantasy that love automatically creates emotional capacity. It doesn't. Sometimes he misses her while actively avoiding her. That contradiction is real. I know because I watched it happen. There were moments I could physically feel him fighting himself internally. He'd pull away for days emotionally, then suddenly return soft again. Long phone calls, unexpected vulnerability, affection that felt almost relieved. Like distance wasn't making him happier either. That's what confused me for so long. If he was avoiding because he didn't care, why did his eyes always soften when we reunited? Why did he keep coming back emotionally? And the answer was uncomfortable. Because avoidance isn't always absence of feeling. Sometimes it's inability to regulate feeling. Huge difference. Still painful though. Maybe even more painful. Because now the feminine starts seeing his woundedness alongside her own pain. And empathy becomes dangerous in relationships like this. Because empathy keeps people emotionally invested far past the point where they're emotionally safe. I think that's why women in these dynamics become so emotionally exhausted. They're trying to understand someone while simultaneously bleeding from the experience of loving them. That's too much emotional labor for one person. And eventually, something inside her starts changing too. Not all at once. Quietly. She stops asking certain questions. Stops reaching emotionally as often. Stops explaining her feelings repeatedly. Not because she no longer cares. Because she's tired of feeling emotionally alone while standing next to someone she loves. And ironically, that's usually when the masculine starts panicking. Not immediately. Late. Always late. Because while she was begging for emotional consistency, he still had emotional access to her. Now suddenly her energy changes. Her softness becomes quieter. Her attention pulls inward. Her reassurance disappears. And avoidant people often don't fully feel loss until connection becomes uncertain on their side too. That's when the silence starts reaching them. That's when distractions stop working as well. That's when they stare at old messages longer than they want to admit. But by then, the feminine is already emotionally exhausted from carrying the relationship alone for too long. There is a point in these relationships where the feminine quietly starts carrying the emotional weight for both people. Not intentionally. It happens gradually. So gradually, actually, that she usually doesn't realize it's happening until she's already exhausted. At first, it just feels like compassion, understanding, patience, emotional maturity. She tells herself, he's overwhelmed, he's struggling, he just needs reassurance. He's not good at expressing emotions. And sometimes those things are true. But somewhere along the way, her empathy slowly turns into emotional labor. Then eventually, emotional survival. That's when the relationship starts living inside her body more than inside the actual connection itself. I remember exactly when I started noticing it with him. Not one dramatic moment. A collection of small ones. Tiny moments where I became responsible for maintaining emotional stability between us. If conversations got tense, I softened first. If he pulled away, I reached gently. If he became distant after intimacy, I acted understanding instead of hurt. And at the time, I thought I was being emotionally evolved. Now, I think I was abandoning myself in very polite ways. That's the dangerous thing about emotionally aware women. They know how to empathize past their own limits, especially when they can sense someone's wounds underneath the behavior. Because once you see the pain beneath someone's avoidance, it becomes harder to stay angry. You start over-explaining their behavior to yourself. He's scared. He's overwhelmed. He's trying. He just doesn't know how. Meanwhile, your own emotional needs slowly start starving quietly in the background. And the feminine usually notices this long before she admits it out loud. Her body notices first. She starts feeling tired after interactions instead of nourished by them. Anxious before seeing him instead of excited. Relieved when conversations go well because emotional consistency has become unpredictable. That relief part is important. Love isn't supposed to feel like surviving small emotional emergencies repeatedly. But when someone becomes inconsistent, the feminine starts treating moments of warmth like emotional oxygen. That changes the entire dynamic. Now, she's no longer simply experiencing love. She's monitoring access to it. I remember one afternoon sitting on my couch staring at our messages trying to decide whether I should say how I actually felt. I had typed this long honest paragraph. Not dramatic. Not accusatory. Just honest. Something like, I miss how emotionally close we used to feel. Simple. But I stared at it forever. Then deleted it. Typed it again. Deleted it again. Because by then, I had already learned something dangerous. His nervous system responded better to my emotional restraint than my emotional honesty. And once the feminine learns that, she starts editing herself constantly. Not because she's fake, because she's trying to preserve connection. That's when emotional exhaustion really begins. The constant self-monitoring. How do I say this without overwhelming him? How do I express her without triggering withdrawal? How do I ask for reassurance without sounding needy? That internal calculation never stops. And eventually she becomes hyper-aware of his moods in a way that honestly starts resembling emotional caregiving more than partnership. She notices the tension in his voice immediately, the emotional shutdowns, the subtle distancing, and without even realizing it, she begins emotionally compensating for them, becoming softer when he withdraws, more understanding when he avoids, less demanding when she's hurting. Meanwhile, nobody's compensating for her. That's the loneliness nobody sees from the outside. Because externally, she still looks loving. But internally, she's carrying fear, confusion, emotional anticipation, self-restraint, empathy, longing, and grief simultaneously. That's too much for one nervous system to hold long-term. I remember becoming obsessed with timing, not in a controlling way, in a survival way. How long he took to respond, how long his calls lasted, how quickly his energy changed after intimacy. I hate admitting that now because it makes me sound emotionally unstable. But I think many women who experience this dynamic understand exactly what I mean. When someone becomes emotionally inconsistent, your brain starts searching for patterns because unpredictability feels unsafe. So now tiny details feel emotionally loaded. A shorter text, a delayed reply, a shift in tone, and the feminine starts carrying all of that information internally while still trying to appear emotionally relaxed externally. That split creates exhaustion. I remember sitting across from friends at dinner pretending to participate in conversation while mentally replaying my last interaction with him. He had sounded distracted earlier on the phone. Not mean, just distant. And the entire rest of my evening became emotionally colored by it. That's when I realized how deeply the connection had entered my nervous system. One small emotional shift from him could change my entire internal state for hours. That scared me, not because I loved him, because I was slowly losing emotional balance inside myself. And honestly, part of the feminine starts resenting herself during this phase. Not him, herself, because she can feel how much energy she's spending emotionally managing the relationship. I remember thinking one night, why am I always the one emotionally tracking this connection? That question hit me hard, because it was true. I was carrying the emotional awareness, the emotional anticipation, the emotional repair work. If tension appeared, I addressed it. If distance appeared, I felt it immediately. If communication weakened, I compensated emotionally. Meanwhile, he often just existed inside the dynamic without analyzing it the same way. And that imbalance slowly started changing my personality. I became less spontaneous, more careful, more emotionally strategic. That's another ugly truth. Women in these dynamics often become emotionally managerial, not because they want control, because they're trying to prevent emotional collapse. So now, instead of simply loving naturally, she starts calculating emotional timing. When should I text? How much vulnerability is safe? Should I give him space? Am I asking for too much? Should I pull back? Love starts feeling like emotional chess instead of connection. That's when the nervous system begins burning out. Especially because the feminine often still sees his goodness underneath everything. That's what makes leaving harder. If he were cruel constantly, anger could create separation. But inconsistent men create confusion instead. Because one beautiful moment resets hope all over again. I remember him calling me late one night unexpectedly after days of emotional distance. And instantly, there he was again. soft voice, warmth, attention, emotional presence. Like the version of him I missed had suddenly returned. We talked for almost 2 hours. At one point, he even said, "I know I've been distant," very quietly, almost ashamed. And hearing that acknowledgement made my entire body relax emotionally. That's how deprived I had become. One moment of emotional honesty felt like water after a drought, which is dangerous. Because now the feminine starts accepting crumbs of emotional consistency as evidence the relationship is healing. Meanwhile, the cycle itself remains unchanged. Warmth, distance, confusion, repair, repeat. And over time, carrying both people emotionally creates quiet resentment. Not loud resentment, subtle resentment. The kind that appears in tiny moments. Like when he says, "I don't know why you're stressed." And she almost laughs because she's been silently holding the emotional weight of the relationship for months. Or when he says, "You overthink everything," without realizing she became hypervigilant because emotional stability kept disappearing unpredictably. That resentment becomes even more painful because part of her still deeply loves him. So now she feels compassion and exhaustion simultaneously. That emotional contradiction is brutal. I remember once sitting in my car after seeing him and realizing I felt emotionally drained instead of connected. That moment scared me more than the possibility of losing him. Because exhaustion changes love. Not immediately, but slowly. You stop reaching naturally. Stop trusting softness. Stop relaxing emotionally. And eventually the feminine begins emotionally muting herself to survive the relationship. That's the part nobody notices at first. She becomes quieter. Not because she has less to say, because she's tired of carrying the emotional conversation alone. She stops bringing up problems repeatedly because she already knows where the conversation goes. Temporary reassurance, momentary closeness, then distance again. And after enough cycles, her body starts protecting itself automatically. That's when the sadness changes shape. Earlier stages feel anxious, hopeful, desperate for clarity. But this stage feels heavy, like emotional fatigue, like loving someone while slowly realizing you cannot continue carrying the relationship for both people. And maybe the saddest part is, the masculine often doesn't fully understand how much she's been holding until she finally stops. That's when he notices the energy change. The softness disappears first, then the emotional availability, then the willingness to keep repairing everything silently. And suddenly, he feels the absence of emotional labor he never fully acknowledged while receiving it. But by then, she's already tired in a way sleep can't fix. Not because she stopped loving him, because loving him started requiring her to abandon herself piece by piece. And eventually, the body refuses to keep paying that price forever. The strange thing about emotional exhaustion is that it doesn't always look dramatic from the outside. Sometimes it just looks quieter. That's how the shift started happening in her. Not with screaming, not with some empowering speech, not even with anger at first. Just less energy, less explaining, less reaching, less emotional chasing. And honestly, the masculine usually misses the seriousness of that shift in the beginning because he's gotten used to carrying the emotional connection for both of them. So when she finally starts pulling inward, it doesn't register immediately. At first, he thinks, "She's just giving me space. She's calming down. Things feel less intense lately." Meanwhile, something much deeper is happening. The feminine is getting tired in a way that changes her nervous system. I remember exactly when it started happening to me. Not the day, the feeling. I was sitting on my bed staring at our conversation after another emotionally confusing week. Another cycle. Warmth, distance, softness, withdrawal. By then, I could practically predict it. That was the depressing part. I knew which version of him I was going to get based on the emotional closeness of the previous interaction. If we had a deep conversation, distance usually followed. If we spent an emotionally intimate weekend together, emotional inconsistency would appear afterward. And one night, after staring at my phone waiting for emotional reassurance that never fully came, something inside me just slowed down. Not healed, not detached, just tired. I remember putting my phone face down on the bed and thinking, I can't keep living like this. Not because he was evil. That's important. He wasn't some cruel villain laughing while I suffered. Actually, I think that made it harder, because part of him genuinely cared. But care without consistency creates emotional malnutrition eventually. And the body knows it before the mind fully accepts it. That's when the feminine begins going cold. Not intentionally, protectively. At first, it's subtle. She stops double texting, stops over-explaining her feelings, stops asking if everything is okay every time his energy shifts. Not because she suddenly feels secure, because she's exhausted from trying to emotionally stabilize someone who keeps drifting internally. I remember him calling me one evening after barely communicating all day. Normally, I would have immediately softened, immediately reconnected emotionally. But that night something felt different inside me. I answered warmly, politely, but emotionally, there was distance now, not punishment, fatigue, and I could feel him noticing it almost immediately. That's the ironic part. The masculine often senses her emotional withdrawal fastest once she stops emotionally reaching for him. Suddenly, the emotional safety net disappears. The constant reassurance, the emotional availability, the willingness to repair tension immediately. And once that energy changes, he starts feeling the instability she's been living inside for months. I remember him asking, "You okay?" Such a simple question, but it almost made me laugh because I had spent so long asking him the exact same thing emotionally while receiving half answers in return. And even then, even exhausted, part of me still wanted to protect him from the truth. That's how deep feminine conditioning runs sometimes. She's emotionally drowning while still trying not to make him uncomfortable. So instead of saying, "No, actually, I feel emotionally abandoned half the time," she says, "Yeah, just tired." Funny how people start speaking the same emotional language eventually, especially avoidance. And the sad part is, the feminine usually doesn't realize how much resentment has built up inside her until her softness starts disappearing. That softness matters more than people think. Not softness as submission. Softness as emotional openness. The willingness to emotionally lean towards someone naturally. Once that begins shutting down, the relationship changes completely. I noticed it in tiny moments first. I stopped rereading his messages obsessively. Stopped feeling immediate relief when he texted. Stopped rearranging my emotional state around his attention. And honestly, that should have felt empowering. Instead, it mostly felt sad. Because detachment after deep attachment doesn't feel glamorous. It feels like grief mixed with exhaustion. Like your nervous system finally giving up after trying too long to keep hope alive. I remember one night he sent me a message that normally would have emotionally affected me for hours. Something sweet. Something emotionally soft. And I just stared at it feeling numb. Not cold in a cruel way. Just emotionally tired. Like my body no longer trusted temporary warmth enough to relax into it. That's what repeated inconsistency does. Eventually, reassurance stops reaching the deeper wound, because the nervous system has learned the closeness might disappear again at any moment. So now even beautiful moments feel unstable. And the masculine usually notices this shift later than the feminine does. Much later. At first, he even benefits from it. The relationship feels calmer now, less emotionally demanding, less pressure. But what he often doesn't realize is the feminine isn't calmer. She's withdrawing emotionally to survive. Huge difference. And eventually, that emotional withdrawal starts becoming visible. She responds slower, stops initiating emotionally vulnerable conversations, stops trying to decode him constantly, and suddenly he feels something unfamiliar. Distance from her. Real distance. Not his controlled distancing. Not his temporary emotional retreat. Her distance. And that affects him differently because feminine withdrawal usually arrives quietly after prolonged emotional exhaustion, not impulsively, which means by the time he notices it, it's already been building for a long time. I remember one weekend we spent together after months of emotional inconsistency, and for the first time, I wasn't anxiously monitoring him anymore. That sounds healthy, right? But it wasn't peace yet. It was depletion. I remember watching him talk while realizing I wasn't emotionally reaching toward him internally anymore. Before, every interaction affected me deeply. Every shift mattered. Now, there was space inside me where hypervigilance used to live. And honestly, that scared him. I could feel it. He became more attentive suddenly, more emotionally present, more affectionate. That's another painful irony in these dynamics. Sometimes the masculine begins emotionally pursuing again only after he feels her detaching for real. Not because he's manipulative necessarily, because loss creates clarity for emotionally avoidant people in ways intimacy often doesn't. When she was constantly emotionally available, part of him unconsciously assumed the connection would survive his inconsistency. Now suddenly her energy feels uncertain, and uncertainty forces emotional presence. I remember him staring at me differently during that phase. Longer, softer, like he was trying to locate something he could feel slipping away emotionally. At one point he even asked quietly, "Have you been pulling away from me?" And internally, I almost broke hearing that. Because where was this awareness when I was emotionally fighting for connection? Where was this emotional attentiveness while I was crying quietly after inconsistent conversations? That's the resentment part nobody likes admitting. The feminine often becomes colder not only from pain, but from the delayed timing of masculine awareness. Because now he's reacting to the emotional absence she developed after surviving his inconsistency for too long. And part of her wants to say, "I needed this version of you months ago." But by then something inside her has already changed. Not love. Trust. Big difference. Love can survive inconsistency longer than trust can. And once trust and emotional safety weakens, the feminine starts emotionally preparing herself for disappointment automatically. That changes how she receives affection. Now, when he gets soft again, part of her melts, while another part braces. That contradiction is heartbreaking. I remember him hugging me once during this phase, and instead of relaxing into it fully, my body stayed slightly tense. Not consciously, protectively. Because my nervous system no longer fully believed consistency would follow closeness. That realization devastated me more than the relationship itself at times. Because I could feel myself changing emotionally, becoming less open, less trusting, less naturally warm. And the masculine usually experiences this stage with confusion first. Because externally she's still there, still kind, still loving in many ways. But energetically something vital has disappeared. The emotional pursuit, the constant softness, the willingness to endlessly hold emotional space. And suddenly, he starts feeling the silence she used to fill. That's when the panic quietly begins. Not dramatic panic, subtle panic. Checking her social media more often, watching her stories immediately, replaying old conversations, feeling strangely unsettled when she doesn't respond emotionally the way she used to. I think avoidant men often believe distance will protect them emotionally, until the distance starts coming from her too. Then suddenly the silence becomes unbearable. And the cruel irony is, by the time he fully feels the loss beginning, she's already exhausted from grieving the relationship while still inside it. I think one of the most painful parts of these relationships is that the masculine often understands the depth of the connection after the feminine has already exhausted herself trying to hold it together. Not always, but often enough that it becomes a pattern people quietly recognize. And I know that realization frustrates a lot of women because by the time he starts feeling everything fully, she's already emotionally bruised from carrying the weight of the relationship mostly alone. That delayed timing changes everything, especially because while she was drowning emotionally in the connection, he often looked relatively fine on the surface. That part hurts too. She's crying in her car after inconsistent conversations. Meanwhile, he's at the gym, at work, laughing with friends, posting normal photos. And from the outside, it looks like he moved on emotionally without difficulty. But avoidant men often don't process emotions in real time. They postpone them, compartmentalize them, distract themselves from them, outrun them temporarily, until eventually silence catches up. And silence always catches up eventually. I remember thinking he didn't care anymore during one phase because of how emotionally composed he seemed after pulling away. That's what confused me most. How calm he looked. How normal he acted. Meanwhile, my internal world felt like emotional static 24 hours a day. I remember seeing him post a random picture once during a period where our connection felt painfully distant. Just coffee, gym, normal life. And I stared at it feeling almost insulted emotionally. Like, how are you functioning this normally? Meanwhile, I could barely make it through grocery shopping without mentally replaying our last conversation. That imbalance can make the feminine feel pathetic honestly, especially when she's already judging herself for caring too much. But what I didn't understand back then was this. Just because someone suppresses emotion successfully in the moment doesn't mean they escaped it. Sometimes they just experience it later, much later. And delayed grief is strange because it often arrives in completely ordinary moments. Not during dramatic heartbreak scenes, during silence, during routine, during random Tuesday evenings when distractions stop working for 5 minutes. I think that's when realization started reaching him. Not during our emotional conversations. Not when I was begging for clarity emotionally. After my energy changed. After I became quieter. After emotional access to me stopped feeling guaranteed. That's when his nervous system finally had enough silence to hear itself. And honestly, I think it scared him. Because once the feminine truly begins emotionally detaching, the atmosphere changes completely. The emotional safety he unconsciously relied on starts disappearing. No more constant reassurance. No more emotional pursuit. No more predictable access to her warmth. And suddenly the absence becomes louder than the relationship itself ever was. I remember one night specifically. We barely spoke that day. Not from fighting, just distance. And around midnight, he sent me a random message. "Are you awake?" Simple. But I could feel the emotional hesitation underneath it. Like someone standing outside a locked emotional door unsure if they're still welcome. And what hurt was realizing Months earlier, I had been the one sending those messages emotionally, trying to reconnect, trying to feel close again, trying to reach him through silence. Now suddenly he was the unsettled one. Not because I became cruel, because I stopped emotionally chasing consistency from someone unwilling to sustain it. That shift changes avoidant people deeply because distance feels safe only when they control it. Once they feel emotional distance coming from the other side too, panic starts leaking through the cracks. Not obvious panic, quiet panic. He starts checking her profile more often, watching stories immediately, rereading conversations, hovering emotionally without fully saying what he feels. And honestly, masculine regret often looks awkward instead of poetic. That's important to say. People romanticize masculine awakening online like it arrives with profound speeches and grand emotional confessions. Sometimes it arrives as a man sitting alone in his car playing one sentence for 3 straight weeks while pretending he's completely fine. Sometimes it looks immature. Avoidant men often realize last through behavior before language. That's why their actions suddenly become inconsistent once the feminine withdraws emotionally. They start reaching indirectly. Random texts, old memories, small check-ins that feel emotionally loaded. I remember him suddenly bringing up tiny details about me months later that I didn't even realize he noticed at the time. Things like my coffee order, the name of a book I mentioned once casually, a story about my childhood I barely remembered telling him. And hearing those details after feeling emotionally unseen for so long almost broke me, because it revealed something painful. He had been emotionally affected more deeply than he knew how to express in real time. And that realization creates complicated grief for the feminine, because now she's stuck between two painful truths. He did care, and he still couldn't love me consistently. Both hurt. I think people underestimate how long emotionally avoidant men can stay disconnected from their own grief, especially when they have distractions, work, attention from other people, routine, noise. But eventually routine stops numbing things. That's when the body starts remembering. Music becomes dangerous. Specific streets become dangerous. Silence becomes dangerous. I think masculine realization often begins physically before emotionally. He suddenly can't focus, feels restless, feels irritated for no clear reason. Then memories start surfacing unexpectedly. Her laugh, her smell, the way she reached for his hand absent-mindedly, the softness he took for granted because it felt permanently available. And avoidant people especially struggle once absence becomes irreversible emotionally, because they often don't understand the value of emotional safety until they no longer have access to it. That sounds harsh, but I think it's true. I remember one conversation we had much later where he admitted quietly, "I didn't realize how far away you've gotten." And internally I almost collapsed hearing that because I had been disappearing emotionally in front of him for months. Slowly, painfully, silently. But he only fully saw it once my warmth stopped reaching for him automatically. That's the tragedy of delayed realization. By the time he emotionally arrives at the depth of the connection, she's already exhausted from surviving it mostly alone. And honestly, part of the masculine often feels shame during this stage too. That's another thing nobody talks about enough. Not just grief, shame. Because now he starts replaying his own behavior differently. The moments he withdrew after intimacy, the emotional inconsistency, the times she reached for reassurance and he minimized it. And hindsight becomes brutal. Especially because avoidant men are often more emotionally aware than they appear. They just suppress awareness while actively inside the dynamic. But once silence removes distraction, everything resurfaces. I think that's why masculine regret often arrives late at night, when stimulation fades, when work ends, when nobody's texting, when there's finally enough quiet to feel. That's when memory becomes emotional, not intellectual. And memory is cruel because it rarely replays the dramatic moments first. It replays tenderness, the way she looked at him when he was vulnerable, the comfort of her presence, the emotional safety he kept pulling away from while simultaneously needing it. Those are the memories that destroy avoidance eventually. Not because they're dramatic, because they're intimate. I remember him once admitting, "I thought I had more time." That sentence stayed with me for months. Because I think avoidant people unconsciously believe emotional connections will wait for them indefinitely while they figure themselves out. They assume the feminine's love is stable enough to survive inconsistency forever, until suddenly it isn't. And by then the realization hits differently. Because now he's not grieving potential anymore. He's grieving access. Access to her softness, her emotional openness, her presence. And masculine grief during this phase often looks deeply conflicted. Part of him wants to reach for her desperately. Another part still fears vulnerability. So now he exists in contradiction, missing her intensely while struggling to communicate cleanly, wanting closeness while fearing rejection, feeling emotions fully while lacking the emotional tools to express them maturely. That contradiction is painful for both people, because by the time he's emotionally ready to face the connection honestly, the feminine is often emotionally tired in ways he still doesn't fully understand. I think that's why some women become numb when the masculine finally opens emotionally later. Not because they stop loving him, because grief changed shape already. Earlier she wanted reassurance desperately. Now she wants peace. And those are very different emotional states. That's what makes delayed realization so tragic. The timing rarely matches. When she was emotionally begging for consistency, he was emotionally overwhelmed. Now that he finally feels the last fully, she's exhausted from waiting inside emotional uncertainty for too long. And maybe the saddest part is, a lot of these men genuinely loved her, just not in a psychologically sustainable way at the time. Which is a painful truth to sit with because it means love itself wasn't the problem. Emotional capacity was. And unfortunately, people can lose each other long before love actually disappears. I think the feminine suffers more in these connections for one very uncomfortable reason. She stayed emotionally present longer. That's it. Not because she was weaker. Not because she loved harder in some grand romantic way. Not because she was spiritually chosen to suffer. She just stayed emotionally inside the relationship while it was hurting her. And that changes a person, especially when the other person copes by disconnecting from themselves every time emotions become too intense. Because now one person is processing the relationship continuously, while the other keeps stepping in and out of emotional contact with it. That imbalance creates completely different timelines of suffering. The feminine grieves in real time. The masculine often grieves in fragments. And honestly, that distinction explains almost everything. I remember how consuming it became for me emotionally. Not just missing him, carrying the emotional uncertainty, the emotional inconsistency, the constant awareness of what was happening beneath the surface between us. Meanwhile, he still had moments where he could temporarily escape the emotional reality of the connection. Work distracted him, friends distracted him, routine distracted him. But the feminine often doesn't compartmentalize that way once deep attachment forms. The relationship follows her everywhere internally, into grocery stores, into work meetings, into random moments at red lights. She hears a song and immediately feels him. She smells his cologne on a stranger, and her chest tightens unexpectedly. She sees something funny and instinctively reaches for her phone before remembering things feel different now. That's what emotional presence actually looks like. Not poetic suffering. Interruption. Constant internal interruption. I remember standing in line at a pharmacy once staring blankly at cough medicine while replaying our last interaction in my head. That moment disturbed me. Not because I missed him, because I realized how deeply the relationship had entered my nervous system. Even ordinary life no longer felt emotionally separate from him. And I think that's why the feminine breaks down first. Not because she's more emotional, because she keeps emotionally processing while functioning. That's exhausting, especially when the masculine keeps sending mixed emotional signals unintentionally. One warm message resets hope. One vulnerable moment reopens attachment. One emotionally intimate night restarts the entire cycle internally. Meanwhile, she's trying to emotionally stabilize herself inside uncertainty. That takes enormous energy. And the difficult truth is, sometimes she participates in the cycle too. I think maturity is admitting that honestly, because eventually the feminine starts chasing emotional clarity in ways that aren't healthy either. Not always externally, internally, obsessing, analyzing, trying to decode him emotionally instead of accepting what his inconsistency is already communicating. I did that constantly. I kept trying to emotionally understand him into consistency, as if enough empathy could finally make the relationship feel safe. But emotional understanding does not automatically create emotional security. That realization hurt me deeply, because part of me genuinely believed love and patience would eventually soften his avoidance. And maybe part of it did, but not enough to stop the damage. That's the part nobody likes talking about. Love can exist inside unhealthy dynamics. Care can exist inside inconsistency. And sometimes both people are emotionally overwhelmed in completely different ways. I remember one conversation where I almost finally told him everything honestly. Everything. How emotionally unstable the inconsistency had made me feel. How much energy I spent trying to emotionally hold us together. How exhausted I was becoming. But instead, I softened my words again. I said, I just miss feeling close to you. And even hearing myself say it, that gently made me feel pathetic afterward. Because the truth was bigger than that. The truth was, I was emotionally drowning quietly while trying not to inconvenience him with it. That sentence alone probably explains why the feminine suffers more in these dynamics. She often minimizes her own pain to protect the relationship. Meanwhile, her body absorbs all of it anyway. And eventually, the body starts protesting. That's when the anxiety deepens. Sleep changes. Appetite changes. Emotional numbness starts mixing with attachment. I remember reaching a point where I felt both desperate for his attention and exhausted by it simultaneously. That contradiction is hard to explain unless you've lived it. Wanting closeness, while resenting how much your emotional stability depends on it. Missing someone, while also feeling relief when they don't text because at least your nervous system gets a break for a few hours. That's not peace. That's emotional burnout. And honestly, I think a lot of feminine suffering comes from trying to emotionally metabolize both her feelings and his unspoken feelings at the same time. Because emotionally aware women often sense what men cannot fully articulate yet. His fear, his overwhelm, his internal conflict, his avoidance after intimacy. She feels all of it. And at first, that emotional awareness creates compassion. Then eventually it creates exhaustion. Because now she's emotionally caring to people. I remember watching him withdraw after vulnerable moments and instantly understanding why. Not intellectually. Physically. I could feel his fear almost. The panic after closeness. The discomfort after emotional exposure. And because I understood it, I kept excusing it. That's the dangerous part. Empathy without boundaries becomes self-abandonment very quickly, especially when the masculine keeps oscillating between intimacy and distance. Because every time he returns emotionally, it confirms her hope that the connection is still real. And is real. That's what makes these dynamics so psychologically devastating. The love is often real. The inconsistency is also real. The care is real. The emotional damage is real too. Both things coexist. And the feminine suffers more because she keeps staying emotionally available to all of it. The beauty, the confusion, the tenderness, the rejection, the longing, all of it. At some point, I realized I had become emotionally hyper-tuned to him in a way that no longer felt healthy. I could hear emotional distance in one sentence, feel tension through text messages, sense withdrawal before he even consciously acted differently. And instead of protecting myself from that awareness, I kept leaning deeper into it, trying to repair it, understand it, prevent it. That's exhausting, especially because avoidant men often don't fully realize how emotionally impactful their inconsistency is while it's happening. To them, they're just overwhelmed, needing space, trying to regulate. Meanwhile, the feminine experiences each withdrawal as emotional rupture because she remained emotionally connected between interactions. That's the timeline difference nobody explains properly. She never fully emotionally leaves the relationship, even during silence. Especially during silence. I remember waking up in the middle of the night sometimes and instinctively checking my phone half asleep. Not because he texted, because my body had become emotionally conditioned to monitor connection. That realization honestly scared me, because I used to be emotionally grounded, independent, calm, present in my own life. Now, suddenly my nervous system revolved around someone else's emotional availability. That loss of self created shame. And I think many women hide that shame instead of talking about it honestly. Because it's humiliating admitting how emotionally destabilized inconsistency can make you. Especially when you know better intellectually. I knew the dynamic wasn't healthy. I knew I was overfunctioning emotionally. I knew I was carrying too much. And still, I couldn't immediately stop loving him. That's another truth people avoid because it sounds weak. Sometimes awareness arrives long before detachment does. And during that gap, the feminine suffers enormously. Because now she sees the reality clearly while still emotionally attached to it. That's brutal. I think people want these stories to have heroes and villains because it makes pain easier to organize psychologically. But honestly, most of these connections are just to emotionally overwhelmed people triggering each other differently. Sometimes she chased too much. Sometimes he withdrew too much. Sometimes both became emotionally immature in response to fear. I know I did. There were moments I became controlling emotionally, hypervigilant, too focused on reassurance. Not because I wanted power, because unpredictability made me emotionally unsafe. And him, there were moments he absolutely breadcrumbed unintentionally, gave just enough warmth to keep emotional hope alive while still remaining inconsistent underneath. Not maliciously always. But impact matters even when intent is complicated. That's the painful maturity of all this. No heroes. No villains. Just wounded people trying to love each other with emotional tools that weren't fully developed yet. And unfortunately, sometimes love alone cannot compensate for emotional inconsistency long term. I think the feminine eventually realizes that in her body before her mind fully accepts it. That's when the grief changes. It becomes less about, why is he pulling away? And more about, how much longer can I survive feeling like this? That question changes everything. Because now the focus slowly shifts from saving the relationship to saving herself emotionally inside it. And maybe that's the saddest part of all. The feminine often doesn't stop loving first. She just reaches a point where staying emotionally present in the relationship hurts more than suppressing parts of herself ever should have. I think the hardest truths are usually the least cinematic ones. Not the dramatic betrayals. Not the screaming endings. Not the obvious heartbreak. The hardest truths are the quiet humiliations. The realizations you arrive at slowly while brushing your teeth, driving home, folding laundry, lying awake at 1:17 in the morning staring at the ceiling because your body already knows something your heart is still negotiating with. And this is probably the hardest truth in connections like this. Sometimes the feminine becomes addicted to potential, not reality. Potential. Potential is dangerous because it feels emotionally alive. It feeds hope, fantasy, possibility, especially when the connection contains genuine intimacy underneath the inconsistency. That's what makes it psychologically complicated. If he treated her badly all the time, she could leave more cleanly. But he didn't. Sometimes he loved her beautifully. That's the problem. Sometimes he looked at her in ways that felt devastatingly real. Sometimes he held her like she was the safest thing in his life. Sometimes his voice softened around her without him even realizing it. And unfortunately, those moments become emotional evidence the feminine uses against herself later. See, it's real. He does care. He's just scared. He'll come around eventually. And maybe part of that is true. But potential can become emotionally addictive when reality keeps failing to match it. I had to admit that to myself eventually. Not all at once. Very slowly. Painfully. I remember sitting in my car after another emotionally confusing interaction with him and suddenly realizing something that made me feel physically sick. I was no longer relating to the relationship as it actually existed. I was relating to what it could become if he finally became emotionally consistent. That realization broke something open inside me, because suddenly I had to confront a question I'd been unconsciously avoiding. What if this version never arrives? Not because he's evil. Not because he doesn't care. What if he simply doesn't have the emotional capacity right now to sustain the kind of intimacy we touched briefly and then lost repeatedly? That question is devastating because it removes fantasy while leaving love intact. And honestly, that's harder than anger. Anger simplifies people. Complexity keeps you emotionally trapped longer. I think a lot of feminine suffering comes from confusing emotional depth with emotional safety. Those are not the same thing. Someone can understand you deeply and still destabilize your nervous system completely. Someone can feel intensely connected to you and still fail to show up consistently. Someone can genuinely love you and still repeatedly retreat from intimacy once it becomes emotionally real. That contradiction is difficult to accept because emotionally we want love to equal safety automatically. But psychologically, it doesn't always work that way. I remember one night we were laying together in silence after a long conversation. He looked peaceful, relaxed. At one point, he reached for my hand absent-mindedly while half asleep and whispered, "I don't want to lose this." And hearing that should have comforted me. Instead, I felt sad. Because by then, I already understood something he still didn't fully understand himself. Wanting connection and sustaining connection are two different emotional skills. And some people genuinely don't realize that until it's too late. That's the part nobody wants to admit. Love is not always the missing ingredient. Sometimes emotional regulation is. Consistency is. Communication is. Self-awareness is. Without those things, even real love starts damaging people, especially emotionally sensitive people. I think part of the feminine keeps waiting because she sees the version of him that appears during moments of emotional openness. The soft version, the honest version, the emotionally available version. And those moments feel so real that it becomes difficult to accept the inconsistent version is real too. But both are him. That's the painful maturity of this entire experience. Not choosing between good him and bad him. Accepting contradiction. Accepting that someone can deeply care about you while still being emotionally unsafe for you in practice. I hated admitting that. Because part of me thought if I loved him correctly enough, patiently enough, softly enough, eventually his fear would relax. Eventually he'd stop pulling away after intimacy. Eventually he'd trust the connection fully. But relationships are not therapy programs. And love cannot force emotional readiness out of someone. That realization felt brutal. Especially because he wasn't pretending. That's what complicated my grief for so long. He wasn't fake. I truly believe that. I think he meant the vulnerable things he said. I think he genuinely felt connected to me. I think losing me genuinely hurt him. And still, he could not consistently stay emotionally present inside the relationship. That sentence took me months to emotionally accept. Maybe years, honestly. Because emotionally unavailable love creates cognitive dissonance. Your brain keeps trying to organize conflicting evidence. He loves me. Then why does he disappear emotionally? He misses me. Then why does intimacy scare him? He says I matter. Then why do I feel emotionally alone half the time? That internal conflict exhausts the feminine psychologically because she keeps trying to reconcile warmth with withdrawal. And eventually, she starts abandoning reality for hope. Not consciously, gradually. She starts emotionally living inside exceptions instead of patterns. Focusing on the beautiful moments, the tenderness, the vulnerability. Meanwhile, her nervous system keeps absorbing the actual pattern underneath everything. Inconsistency. That's why these relationships become so addictive emotionally. The connection feels profound enough to justify enduring emotional instability longer than she normally would. I remember defending him to people constantly, minimizing my own pain while explaining his behavior compassionately. He's just overwhelmed. He's been through a lot. He struggles expressing emotions. And maybe all of that was true. But eventually, I had to ask myself a much harder question. Why am I endlessly understanding someone who keeps emotionally exhausting me? That question changed something in me. Because suddenly I realized how little compassion I was extending toward myself inside the dynamic. I kept trying to understand his fear while ignoring the fact that I was becoming emotionally unwell too. Anxious, hypervigilant, obsessive, emotionally depleted. And still, I kept romanticizing the connection because the emotional depth felt undeniable. That's another truth nobody likes admitting. Intensity can masquerade as compatibility, especially when inconsistency is involved. The highs feel euphoric because the lows create emotional deprivation. So now every moment of closeness feels disproportionately meaningful. And the feminine starts associating emotional relief with love itself. That's dangerous. Because eventually she stops asking, is this relationship healthy for me? And starts asking, how do I keep access to the connection? Huge difference. I remember the exact moment I realized I was emotionally bargaining with reality. He had withdrawn again after a deeply intimate period between us. Not dramatically, Just enough. Enough to reactivate uncertainty. And I sat there staring at my phone thinking, if he would just fully choose this relationship, everything would finally settle. Then another thought arrived quietly underneath it. But what if he can't? That thought terrified me, because it meant I had to confront something much more painful than rejection. Limitation. His emotional limitation. My inability to fix it. The possibility that love existed without sustainability. And honestly, that grief feels very adult. Not cinematic. Not dramatic. Just deeply sad. Because now there's no villain to hate. Just two people who genuinely affected each other deeply while lacking the emotional tools to create stability together. I think the feminine eventually reaches a point where she has to stop asking whether the connection was real. That question keeps people trapped for years. The better question becomes, was the reality of this relationship emotionally survivable for me? That's harder to answer honestly, because sometimes the answer is no even when love existed. And maybe that's the part nobody wants to admit most of all. Sometimes he did love her. Sometimes he knew exactly how special she was. Sometimes losing her genuinely broke parts of him emotionally. And still, he could not become the emotionally consistent partner she needed before the relationship damaged both of them. That truth feels almost unbearable at first because it destroys fantasy without destroying feeling. She can no longer comfort herself by believing he never cared. But she also can't fully stay trapped in, one day love will magically fix this. Instead, she's left sitting in the most painful emotional middle ground possible. He felt it too, and still couldn't stay fully present inside it. That realization changes the feminine permanently, not because it makes her stop loving, because it forces her to finally separate love from emotional safety. And honestly, that lesson hurts more than the heartbreak itself sometimes. I think people imagine endings as events. A breakup text, a final conversation, someone walking away dramatically while music plays in the background of their pain. But honestly, some relationships end emotionally long before they end physically, and some never fully end at all. They just become quieter inside you over time, less sharp, less consuming, less alive in your nervous system, until one day you realize you went an entire afternoon without thinking about them. And instead of relief, you feel grief. Because forgetting someone slowly can feel almost as painful as losing them suddenly, especially when the connection genuinely changed you. I think that's the ending nobody talks about enough. Not reconciliation, not revenge, not becoming fully healed. Just quiet emotional reorganization. The feminine eventually stops waiting emotionally before she stops loving emotionally. That gap between those two things is devastating. Because people assume once you stop chasing, you stop caring. Not true. Sometimes she still loves him deeply. She's just too exhausted to keep emotionally surviving the inconsistency anymore. I remember that phase vividly. Nothing dramatic happened externally. That's what made it feel so lonely. No official ending. No clean closure. No final speech. Just two people slowly becoming emotionally harder to reach. I remember waking up one morning and realizing the first thing I felt wasn't anxiety anymore. That should have felt like progress. Instead, it felt strangely empty. For months, my nervous system had been organized around him, checking for emotional shifts, waiting for messages, bracing for inconsistency, hoping for reassurance. Now suddenly, silence, not external silence, internal silence. And I didn't know who I was inside it yet. That's the strange thing about healing from emotionally consuming relationships. At first, peace feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Your body keeps waiting for emotional impact that no longer arrives with the same intensity. I remember picking up my phone automatically one afternoon to check whether he had texted me, then realizing I didn't actually care in that panicked way anymore. And instead of feeling victorious, I sat there quietly grieving the version of me that once did. Because attachment is intimate, even unhealthy attachment. You build rituals around someone emotionally, checking messages, thinking of them first, saving stories to tell them later, mentally including them in your day. When that disappears, there's emptiness before freedom arrives. Nobody explains that part properly. They make healing sound empowering constantly. Sometimes it's just quiet. Sometimes it's sitting in your kitchen staring at nothing because your nervous system finally stopped fighting for connection and now it doesn't know what to do with all the silence. And honestly, part of her still misses him during this phase. That's another uncomfortable truth. Not the chaos. Him. His laugh. The softness he showed rarely, but sincerely. The intimacy that existed between the confusion. I think mature grief is finally admitting the beautiful parts were real too. Not romanticizing them. Not building fantasy around them. Just allowing reality to stay emotionally complex. Because some people genuinely touch your life deeply while still being unable to love you sustainably. Both things can be true. I remember hearing a song once months later while driving at night. Nothing dramatic. Just an ordinary song we used to play in the car. And suddenly there he was again emotionally for a few seconds. The memory of his hand on the steering wheel. The way he used to glance over while singing certain lyrics quietly. The warmth. The familiarity. And for a moment I missed him so intensely it physically hurt. Then just as quickly, it passed. That's how endings often happen for real. Not through permanent emotional destruction. Through shorter visits from grief. Smaller emotional waves. Less panic. More acceptance. And eventually the feminine stops needing the relationship to become something different in order to survive emotionally. That's the real shift. Not, I don't love him anymore. More like, I can't keep abandoning myself waiting for this to become emotionally safe. Huge difference. I think people underestimate how heartbreaking that realization is. Because by this stage, she usually understands him more compassionately than ever. That's the cruel irony. Earlier stages contain anger, confusion, blame. Later stages often contain understanding. She sees his fear more clearly now. His emotional limitations. His avoidance. His internal conflict. And because she understands him better, letting go becomes quieter. Not easier. Quieter. I remember one night we're reading old messages between us after months of emotional distance. Not obsessively this time. Almost gently. And what struck me wasn't the inconsistency anymore. It was how human both of us sounded. Two people trying, failing, reaching, retreating, misunderstanding each other while simultaneously loving each other in imperfect ways. No villains. Just emotional immaturity colliding with genuine attachment. That realization softened me. Not toward the relationship itself necessarily. Toward reality. Because I think part of healing is letting go of the need to simplify people in order to move on. He wasn't purely avoidant. I wasn't purely selfless. He wasn't heartless. I wasn't perfectly emotionally healthy either. We were human. That truth matters. Especially online, where everyone wants relationships reduced into neat psychological categories. But real emotional pain is messier than that. Sometimes he acted immature. Sometimes I became emotionally obsessive. Sometimes he withdrew unfairly. Sometimes I overfunction emotionally instead of setting boundaries. That complexity doesn't erase the love. It just explains why love alone couldn't save the relationship. And maybe that's the deepest grief of all. Realizing connection and compatibility are not always the same thing. You can feel profoundly emotionally seen by someone and still slowly lose yourself inside the dynamic. I think the feminine eventually reaches a point where she stops trying to rewrite the story, stops waiting for the perfect apology, the perfect realization, the perfect timing, because even if those things arrive eventually, they cannot undo the emotional reality of what the relationship became. That acceptance feels strangely calm. Sad, but calm. I remember one moment so clearly. I was folding laundry late at night with some random show playing in the background. Completely ordinary moment. And suddenly I realized I hadn't checked his profile in weeks. The old version of me would have found that impossible. And instead of excitement, I just stood there holding a teaser, feeling this strange ache in my chest. Because part of me knew something irreversible had happened quietly. The emotional waiting had ended. Not the love entirely. Not the memory. The waiting. That distinction matters. Because waiting consumes enormous life force emotionally. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for consistency. Waiting for someone to become emotionally ready. Once the waiting stops, grief changes shape completely. Now there's space where anticipation used to live. And space can feel lonely before it feels peaceful. I think that's why some women accidentally reopen old connections during this stage. Not because they truly want the cycle again. Because emptiness feels unfamiliar. Chaos had become emotionally familiar. Longing had become routine. Emotional hypervigilance had become identity. Without it, they temporarily feel untethered. But eventually, something softer begins replacing the obsession. Not immediate happiness. Not triumphant healing. Just self-return. Tiny moments at first. Laughing fully again without emotional heaviness underneath it. Sleeping peacefully. Enjoying silence. Feeling emotionally present in your own life again. And maybe that's the quiet miracle nobody glamorizes enough. Not reunion. Recovery. The slow rebuilding of your nervous system after spending too long emotionally bracing for inconsistency. I think the feminine eventually understands something deeply painful but deeply freeing. She was never crazy for feeling the connection. The connection was real. The love was real. The emotional impact was real. The chemistry, the intimacy, the attachment, all real. But reality also includes consequences. And the consequence of loving someone emotionally unavailable for too long is that eventually your body begins begging you to choose peace over potential. Even if your heart still loves them. That's the part people don't clap for. Don't romanticize. Don't turn into pretty quotes online. The quiet ending. The ordinary sadness. The slow detachment. The unanswered questions that never fully disappear. And honestly, maybe that's adulthood emotionally. Not getting perfect closure. Just learning how to carry unresolved love without letting it destroy your relationship with yourself anymore. Because sometimes the feminine awakens first, not because she's spiritually superior, but because someone had to stay emotionally awake long enough to finally admit, this love hurt me too much to keep surviving this way. And saying that out loud is sometimes the real beginning of healing.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.